I'm Bethany Goldblum. This colloquium is co-sponsored by the Nuclear Science and Security Consortium. The Nuclear Science and Security Consortium is a multi-institution initiative composed of 8 universities and 5 national labs. And we're working here at UC Berkeley to train the next generation of nuclear security experts while engaging in research and development in support of the nation's non-proliferation mission. And Professor Michael Nacht is a professor in the Goldman School of Public Policy. He is the co-teacher of the nuclear security course, which is co-listed with nuclear engineering and sponsored by the Nuclear Science and Security Consortium. He's also the head of the cross-cutting area of nuclear security policy within the consortium. Michael is an expert on nuclear weapons policy issues, and he's served in the government a number of times, most recently in the Obama administration as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Global Strategic Affairs.
Okay.
So some people will get that introduction and say, I'm actually confused about many things, not just one thing. So I'll try to demonstrate that over the next 3 years or so. So I'm delighted to be here. Nuclear engineering is becoming my second home on campus, thanks to my training colleagues Prof and Bigger and Phi Vetter, Mina, and others. So some of you know a lot about this stuff. You can give a lecture and I can take notes. But I'm going to give an overview of where I see nuclear arms control going. And then we can have a discussion about the issues. So these are the topics. I spent some time in the Pentagon, as Bethany mentioned. In the Pentagon, you need a PowerPoint presentation to go to the men's room. So I decided to slow down on PowerPoint since. So this is my slide. This is it. So it just has all these parts to it. So I'll try and be mindful of the time and just go through it sort of systematically. So I wanted to begin just with some general comments with the value of bilateral or multilateral nuclear arms control in the past. You know, we had a big buildup in primarily U.S. and Soviet nuclear weapons from the late 40s through into the 60s. At that time, actually, there was an interesting meeting that was held in Cambridge, Mass, on whether some theoretical ideas about arms control as distinct from disarmament could be usefully implemented. And some people who later became world famous, like Assistant Professor Henry Kissinger and Associate Professor Tom Schelling, who won a Nobel Prize, and quite a few others, former science advisors to the president, met. And they laid out a plan for arms control, which is to limit the armaments, but not to get rid of them. Limit them in terms of their lethality, in terms of their cost, and in terms of the damage they could overall do. This was accepted in the late 60s. The first major nuclear arms control negotiation began between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. That became the SALT negotiations, Strategic Limitation Talks negotiation. Ending in the SALT I agreements in 1972, which is a limitation on offensive arms and also great limitations on ballistic missile defense. Subsequently, there have been a whole range of limitations that have reduced the total number of deployed. The most recent has been the New START Treaty. This was negotiated and entered into force while I was in the government. I was one of the Defense Department representatives to the negotiating team. And this produced an agreement of 1,550 offensive deployed weapons on each side. There are also various subcategories, which I won't go into the details unless you want. The main thing is that, maybe it's worth mentioning, under United States law, an agreement with a foreign country is called a treaty if it's presented to the U.S. Senate and 2/3 of the Senate vote to ratify it. Then it's called a treaty. If it's not presented to the U.S. Senate at all, it's called an executive agreement. There's no other distinction between the two. Administrations often go the executive agreement route because they don't think it could pass the Senate. In this case, it was tricky whether Obama could get the 67 votes. He actually did. He got about 71 or 72 votes. And once the treaty is ratified, it has to be physically deposited in the capitals of the participating countries, in this case, Washington for the U.S., Moscow for Russia, and also Geneva, Switzerland, because that's historically, it's a UN center, and that's where arms control treaties have been deposited. Once the treaty's been deposited by both sides, it enters into force, EIF. Until that very moment, it has no legal standing. Once it is entered into force, it's valid under international law. So it took from when this treaty was signed, which was December of 2009, until it was ratified February of 2011 to enter into force. And it's a 10-year treaty. So the New START treaty ends February of 2021. It would seem like 1,000 years from now, but now it's 3.5 years. So it's not that far away. And this is the only international agreement that is limiting the deployment of major intercontinental weapons on the U.S. and Russian sides. Now, in the meantime, there was some legacy from the Cold War that was very important, particularly this INF Treaty, Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. In the early 80s, when Reagan was president, and before Gorbachev was Secretary General of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the Soviets began to deploy very effective intermediate range systems into the western part of the Soviet Union and into the East European countries, which they then occupied, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, East Germany, and so forth. And they were called the SS-20s, very effective intermediate range ballistic missiles that could destroy almost every important target in Western Europe. The U.S. was quite disturbed by this and began to deploy its own systems after a lot of debate, ground-launched cruise missiles and Pershing II missiles into Western Europe. This led to the start of a negotiation between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, which produced the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, signed in 1987, entered into force in 1988, the last year of the Reagan administration. This actually was the most significant arms control agreement that Reagan had signed. Oh, and by the way, in terms of sort of domestic politics, for the most part, Democrats support arms control, Republicans don't. Most agreements are signed by Republican administrations, not Democratic administrations. Why? Because when the Democrats are in power and support arms control agreements, the Republicans block them. When Republican administrations want to support arms control agreements, the Republicans support them, and the Democrats support them, so it's enough to go through. So if you look at the history of most of these agreements, they're mostly signed under Republican administrations, an odd fact of American politics. What's important now is that in 2001, the very end of 2001, then President George W. Bush announced that the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which had been in place since 1972, was no longer in the U.S. national interest because we needed missile defenses against regional threats like North Korea and Iran. And every one of these treaties has a clause that says if there is a supreme threat to the national interest, we can withdraw on 6 months' notice. So Bush wasn't violating the treaty. He was just exercising the U.S. legal right to withdraw from the treaty. But this caused a big stir in Russia. And one of the Russian reactions was, they said, if you withdraw from the ABM treaty, we find the INF treaty no longer of value. But they didn't do anything about it. In recent times, actually since Obama's been elected now, so at the end of the Obama term, U.S. intelligence has revealed that we have evidence of the deployment of Russian ground-launched cruise missiles and short-range ballistic missiles, which would violate the INF treaty. So officially now, the U.S. has declared that Russia is in violation of the INF treaty. The Russians deny this. There's no resolution of it. The U.S. has not done anything about it, and neither has Russia. So it's in a state of limbo in terms of the status of that treaty. These are the two main bilateral nuclear arms control treaties that govern U.S. Russia strategic relations. Simultaneously, there's been a big effort on the multilateral front. Obviously, there were concerns about nuclear proliferation from the early 50s. In the 50s, the British and the French, and then the Chinese in the 60s all acquired nuclear weapons. So there have been 5 nuclear states: U.S., Russia, Britain, France, China. And by the early 60s, people were predicting that by the end of the 60s, there'd be 30 nuclear weapon states. We have to do something about it. You can't have, unregulated nuclear proliferation. And that led to the completion of the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, which was signed in '68 and entered into force in 1970. And this basically says there are 2 classes of states. There are the 5 nuclear weapon states, and there's everybody else. It's highly discriminatory. The U.S., Russia, France, China, and Britain say we have them, but no one else should have them. And as an incentive to keep you from getting them, we'll make sure you have all kinds of support for nuclear energy for electric power generation. That will be the price we'll pay for you to stay non-nuclear. So into the 70s was 5 nuclear weapon states: U.S., Russia, China, France, Britain, and nobody else. In the meantime, there were nuclear development programs in many other countries. The Israelis had a clandestine program for quite a while, initially supported by the French. And the Israelis are in a particular unique situation. They have never declared they're a nuclear weapon state. They have never declared they are not a nuclear weapon state. They have never tested a nuclear weapon. However, publicized Western intelligence estimates are that they have 200 nuclear weapons, most of it to be used against Arab enemies, or most now against Iran, which has publicly announced their decision to destroy Israel. However, it has remained in a sort of special category. Then, in 1998, 2 states that had flirted with nuclear weapons detonated nuclear weapons and declared themselves nuclear weapon states, and that was Pakistan and India. So they are now officially declared nuclear weapon states. They never signed the NPT. They didn't violate it because they were never parties to it. Oh, by the way, Israel also has never signed the NPT. They're the 3 major states that never signed it. There's a reason why they didn't sign it, because they were going to have nuclear weapons. So that gets us to 8. The original 5 plus those 3 are 8. And now you have the North Korean case, which I'm sure you're quite familiar with. They are declared, they had been in the NPT, they withdrew, and they are now officially, their government has declared themselves a nuclear weapon state. So they're 9. And you have, back in the pack, doing some work but not yet deployed, Iran. But the agreement that we had with them, which is down here, I'll get to in a minute, has forestalled their nuclear weapons program. So at the moment, right tonight, November 13, 2017, there are 9 official nuclear weapon states. The question is, can this be stopped? Can it be promoted? What happens to the pace of nuclear weapons proliferation? The American policy from every administration, from Truman through Obama, Republicans and Democrats, has been more is worse. The more states that have nuclear weapons, the more likely they'll be used. Once nuclear weapons are used again in anger, it's a whole new world with horrible consequences. Now, the Trump administration has had a somewhat slightly different view of this. Depends on what you read and who you listen to. During the campaign, President Trump said, gee, North Korea has nuclear weapons, maybe Japan and South Korea should have nuclear weapons, seemingly to support nuclear proliferation. Later on, he talked to the Saudis, maybe you should have nuclear weapons. On the other hand, publicly as president, he has not done that. And the key senior cabinet members of his department, Secretary of State Tillerson and Secretary of Defense Mattis, have not in any way endorsed nuclear proliferation. So de facto at the moment, there's no major change in U.S. policy on proliferation. We oppose it. Any questions or comments or corrections? You know, I've been lecturing at Berkeley 20 years. I never get questions, just corrections. Okay, I'll move along. So that's not New Start and INF for bilateral. NPT is the big one. Then there's a question about testing. What about a comprehensive test ban treaty? So originally, going back to the early 60s, after the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, President Kennedy himself was deeply concerned that these weapons were so dangerous they could blow up the world. And he was convinced that he had to at least do something, and that led to the Limited Test Ban Treaty, LTBT, in 1963. Just to show how difficult it is to even get these agreements, Kennedy was fearful that the Joint Chiefs of Staff would testify before Congress that it was a danger to the United States to have this agreement, which would have killed it because it had to be ratified. But he was able to show through his technical people that if the U.S. just tested underground and not on the ground or in air or in space, we could still develop our nuclear weapons. So the chiefs were convinced it wouldn't forestall our nuclear enhancement capability as long as we could test underground, which Kennedy did not say publicly. And that was the deal, that was the Limited Test Ban Treaty. Limited means no testing on the water, under the water, in air, in space, but you could test underground. So that was the LTBT in 63. In 74, President Ford moved further to limit the yields on underground testing. But what has been eluding us is a comprehensive test ban treaty, eliminating all nuclear testing of all kinds. Remember, we've had nuclear tests by the North Koreans this year. That would be in violation of CTBT. We don't have. So there was an agreement, there was a CTB that was signed, and the U.S. signed it, but it didn't ratify it. It didn't ratify it because it didn't have the support in the Senate. As recently as in the Clinton years, I was there at the time, Clinton submitted the CTBT for Senate ratification. And in fact, then Senator Biden was put in charge of rounding up the votes to get the CTBT ratified. He failed miserably. Not only didn't they get 67 votes, I don't even think they got 52 votes. It was completely defeated. Why? Because some of the senators feel that the Russians could cheat with very, very low yield explosions and we wouldn't know and enhance their capability while we would stop testing. And that's been a showstopper for all these years. As recently as the latter part of the Obama administration, President Obama was thinking again of submitting the CTBT for ratification, and he chose not to do so because he was informed there's no way, they don't have the votes. President Trump has not said anything to my knowledge about the CTBT. So the CTBT is on hold. The Limited Test Ban Treaty holds. Underground testing is still permitted. And of course, the North Koreans are doing that. So that's the status of the CTBT. Now, of course, in more recent years, the last 15 or 20 years, space and cyber issues have come to the forefront. Not only as central aspects of military policy and strategy, but it's deeply connected to nuclear weapons, right? I mean, the space issues are very important for guidance, for early warning, for many different important military functions. Cyber can lead to command and control problems if they're attacked. So space and cyber are critical elements. We haven't gotten very far at all with any kind of international agreements on space or cyber. When I was in the government, I can tell you, when policy people said, let's discuss space and cyber international agreements, the intelligence community in the US government was very opposed, saying we have big advantages in this area. We don't want any limits to our capability through these agreements. So we couldn't even get interagency agreement for space and cyber. Now, it might happen down the road, but we don't have anything now. So that's a quick summary of some of the core issues in nuclear arms control. Now, with respect to proliferation prospects, how are we doing? I think we have a little time here. Obviously, the most prominent one at the moment is North Korea. So North Korea has worked on a nuclear weapons program at least since the early 80s, maybe since the 70s. As you know, they've only had 3 leaders, all in the Kim family. Right? Kim Il-sung was a young communist in Moscow, and Stalin appointed him himself as the new head of North Korea. He said, you're the new head of North Korea, go there. And so in 1946, Kim Il-sung became the supreme leader of North Korea. He was the leader right through till his death in 1993. Actually, it was interesting. Clinton was president, and former President Carter wanted to go to North Korea to talk to Kim about his program. Clinton did not want him to go. Actually, relations between President Clinton and President Carter have never been warm. But ultimately, Clinton said, okay. Carter went to speak to Kim Il-sung. Carter said, I think we may have an agreement. Carter came home, and Kim Il-sung dropped dead of a heart attack. So people say, gee, we should send President Carter to various other leaders to adopt him. Maybe he goes there, they drop dead. Kim Il-sung was replaced by one of his many sons, various children with various, not spouses, but various women. And that was Kim Jong-il. And Kim Jong-il was the dear leader from 1994 until 2008 when he got sick and died. And he was replaced by one of his sons, Kim Jong-un, who is the current leader of North Korea. So one family has controlled North Korea throughout 1946 until tonight. Clearly, there's been a major acceleration of the North Korean nuclear program and ballistic missile program in the last number of years. I think there remain questions: have they gotten aid from the Chinese or the Russians or the Iranians or anybody else? Or is it purely indigenous? The intelligence community has been quite surprised at the pace and quality of their program development. They have an unknown number of nuclear weapons. Some public statements are in the 20 to 60 weapon range. It's a soft number. And they have an unknown number of ballistic missiles. The weapons are buried deeply underground. The missile silos are underground. They also can launch missiles from ballistic missiles with transporter ejectors, which are mobile systems. So it could be here now and could be over on Sproul Hall in 20 minutes and launch from there. It makes targeting them extremely difficult. North Korea has obviously threatened South Korea. They've threatened Japan. They have not threatened Taiwan, but they've threatened the United States. They've threatened Guam, where we have major forces capable of attacking North Korea. They've inherently threatened U.S. forces in Japan, and they've threatened the continental United States. Kim Jong-un has made a statement saying he'll start negotiating with the U.S. once he has an invulnerable nuclear capability that can destroy cities on the east coast of the United States, including Washington, D.C. That's a public statement by Kim Jong-un. So Trump has said this is intolerable. We can't admit to this kind of condition. And Trump's main diplomatic effort, sensible, has been to go to the Chinese, who provide 85% of North Korean food and fuel, to urge pressure by the Chinese on North Korea to come to the negotiating table. So far without success. What happens if there's no success? We don't know. President Trump has used some pretty strong language, fire and fury, and so forth. And of course, he's just returning now from his 5-country trip to Asia. By the way, this is the longest Asian trip by any U.S. president, I think, in the last 30 years or so. Now, another concern we have here, you say, well, why don't we just, cool it? Why don't we just say we'll deter North Korea and we'll contain North Korea? That was a strategy with the Soviet Union. One of the concerns is that if North Korea shows the value of nuclear proliferation, then it will stimulate further proliferation. That South Korea will say, we need our own weapons to defend ourselves. The Japanese will say, we need our own. And other states in other parts of the world might say they need their own. So there's great concern about the precedential nature of acquiescing to a North Korean nuclear capability. However, to go after it, to defeat it militarily, is a huge problem. The North Koreans have large numbers. The estimated number is 14,000. I think that's a low number. 14,000 artillery tubes in the southwest portion of North Korea that could destroy all of Seoul, which is 25 million people, in 30 minutes. So you could have millions of people killed in the first 30 minutes of the war. They have their nuclear forces. They've got ICBMs. They have chemical and biological weapons that possibly could be launched by ballistic missiles to attack targets in Japan. It could be a gruesome conflict. That's why the Trump administration, I think, has rightly said that if there's a war, the amount of damage, death, and destruction would be incalculable. Mattis and Tillerson have said this a number of times. So hopefully it won't happen, but right now there doesn't appear to be any easy way out of this conundrum. The other concern would be, even though Taiwan is outside the scope of this, if it appears that North Korea will continue to have nuclear weapons, Taiwan, concerned about its own safety vis-a-vis China, might also initiate a nuclear program. By the way, both South Korea and Taiwan had nuclear programs in the 1970s that were stopped through U.S. pressure. Japan had some secret papers done by Nakasone in the 1990s on a secret nuclear program. U.S. pressure stopped that, but it's not clear that this will continue. We've had basically a 70-year situation, no nuclear weapon use. Doesn't have to go on forever. We don't like it to go on forever, I think, but it's not inevitable. Now let's turn to another part of the world, Iran and the joint program. It's JCPO, a Joint Comprehensive Program of Action. This, I think the U.S. was very concerned about the Iranian nuclear program. They had very large numbers of gas centrifuges, getting a lot of highly enriched uranium to their program. The U.S. mounted multiple efforts at economic sanctions, and then around 2008, 2009 also launched, with Israeli support, cyber attacks against the centrifuges of Iran, which derailed their centrifuges for quite a while, maybe a year or 18 months. But it was only temporary palliative. Eventually, after many years, the U.S. got the European countries and others and the Japanese to agree to economic sanctions against Iran. They're reluctant because there's a lot of business to do in Iran. Iran's a rich country. It's got a lot of oil. It's got a budding middle class. It's got a lot of experienced, educated people. And there was too much money to be made to ignore that market. Finally, over many years, they collaborated. And then that hurt the Iranian economy a lot. Some of the negotiators of this agreement whom I met with say that ultimately it was the lethality of the constraints, the economic sanctions, that brought Iran to the conference table. It was a 2-year negotiation leading in 2015 to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. This is the JCPOA. But now, President Trump came in. President Trump campaigned that the Iranian agreement was the worst single U.S. agreement signed in the 250-year history of the United States. You can get into argument whether that's right or not, but anyway, he couldn't be more clear that he wanted to end it. He then has been considering it for quite some time, and now what he's done is he has said publicly, the U.S. has now said publicly, that Iran has violated the spirit of the agreement. Now, what is the spirit of the agreement? The spirit of the agreement is, you and I agree on X, that's the letter of the agreement. But there are other things I expect you to do, and if you don't do it, that's the spirit of the agreement. This is a nuclear agreement. This is just about nuclear arms control. The Iranians are doing a lot of other things the U.S. doesn't like, right? They're promoting terrorism. They're supporting Hezbollah in Lebanon. They're supporting Hamas in Gaza. They're supporting the Assad regime in Syria. They're supporting revolutionary groups in Yemen. These are all things the U.S. doesn't like, but they were completely outside the agreement. But this is what President Trump cited. They should be behaving properly, even though it's not part of the agreement. So what he's done now is he's kicked it to the Congress, and he said to the Congress, you need to determine whether to reimpose sanctions on Iran, call them not in compliance, and terminate the agreement. And they have about 60 days to do that. So we don't know. We'll see what the Republican-controlled Congress decides to do. I think there's lukewarm support for it, even among the Republicans in Congress, but they may go along with it, in which case we have a whole new problem, additional problem with the Iranians. And the same thing as with East Asia, if Iran was on an unbridled path toward a nuclear capability, you'd see Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, all possibly as new nuclear weapon states. Finally, you have the nuclear terrorism issue, which was thought at one time to be the most important. Surprisingly, I think to many analysts, neither Al-Qaeda nor ISIS has really made a lot of progress in terms of a dirty bomb or a nuclear capability. They either haven't had the cooperation from other states or from companies. They don't have the indigenous capability themselves. Doesn't mean it won't happen. There's always been concern that there could be a nuclear bomb set off in Times Square by ISIS or Al-Qaeda. And there's a lot, I can tell you, a lot of counterintelligence effort designed to make sure that doesn't happen. But so far, fortunately, no major crisis. So this is an extraordinary, yes, ma'am.
Do we know that ISIS and Al-Qaeda are pursuing?
Yes, both the leaders of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, bin Laden, when he was head of Al-Qaeda, and the head of ISIS have said, we are seeking a nuclear capability to destroy the West. Now that may just be words, it may be more than words, but there's a lot of effort to try to forestall any capability. So I would say at the moment, this array of issues, each of which is sort of unsettled, is the most daunting nuclear agenda any administration has faced since the 50s. None of these are resolved. Not the New START Treaty, given the U.S. Russia relationship, the INF Treaty, the NPT, the CTBT, space and cyber, all of these issues. Now, one of the first clues you'll get to Trump nuclear policy, official nuclear policy, is the Trump administration nuclear posture review. So every 4 years, the Congress mandates that the new administration submit to the Congress an unclassified and classified version of what U.S. nuclear strategy is. I worked intimately on the 2010 nuclear posture review. That was a document that called for more attention to the terrorist threat, and it was consistent with President Obama's view that we should lower the role of nuclear weapons in national security. This does not appear at all to be the Trump view, but we don't know. So sometime in early, or maybe by April of 2018, next year, the Trump administration will release its nuclear posture review. There'll be hearings on it, and we'll see. I have an opportunity in a couple of weeks. I'll be going to Washington, where there's supposed to be a briefing by the people who are drafting it on what they can tell us about what's going to be in the treaty. But it's right now it's just conjecture. Not the treaty, but the nuclear posture review. So that's where we stand. Is nuclear arms control dead? No. But I'd say it's on somewhere between on hold and on life support. And you can come out of life support, you go into the ICU, and then you become better. I hope that's the case here. If there's kind of a cessation of all nuclear arms control, I think it reduces the barriers to further proliferation and ultimately to nuclear weapon use. So I think that it's a real danger. Okay, I've confused you on many fronts. I promised I would, and I did. Now we have 17 minutes for corrections. Thank you very much. Okay, John.
How does North Korea have this technical ability now? Are the Russians providing a lot of technical expertise? How can they have the kind of fuel they need and all these other things?
Right. So great question. How could, it's essentially, is all this North Korean progress indigenous? And the answer is, my answer of what I think the government, U.S. government knows is we don't know. We don't know. They've been surprised. They have a lot of smart people. who are educated from very young ages, like 5 or 6, to work in specific areas. There was a man who was an army official who defected, and he said his entire life from the age of 5 was in a special community only devoted to the development of senior military officers. His entire life, separated from his family, that's all he did. And they have this in different areas. So they have that in the nuclear area. My own suspicion is there was some support, whether it's from Iran. Iran has nuclear capability and missile capability. There was actually photographs of a North Korean agent in a Ukrainian missile factory. Ukraine was the principal developer of Soviet missiles during the Soviet years. Whether China has continued or Russia has resuscitated support. Of course, Russia and China are not allowed to do it under the terms of the NPT. The NPT prohibits any nuclear state, the 5, from aiding the non-nuclear state. And of course, Putin and Xi Jinping would say we're not doing anything. I have no personal knowledge that they have done it, but it does seem a little odd. They made enormous progress in a very short time.
Also question about North Korea. If I remember correctly, there was agreement during Clinton administration for
Yes.
North Korea to stop their,
Right.
nuclear arms program in exchange for construction of nuclear reactor for energy production.
Right.
What happened to that?
Right. So actually, I was in the Clinton administration at that time. The agreement was we knew that they had a plutonium reprocessing capability. They agreed to cease operation of that capability in return for just what you said, and also energy and fuel and possibly food. This was going to be the beginning of a whole new relationship with North Korea. And the U.S. did not fully comply with that. And also, this is an agreement that I think the North Koreans thought would involve the Chinese and the Russians, and they also didn't deliver what the North Koreans expected. So then in 2002, actually Sig Hecker, who's at Stanford now and used to be director of Los Alamos, went to North Korea and they said, "Oh, we'd like to show you our secret uranium reprocessing, uranium enrichment facility." So they had a whole separate parallel track. They stopped the reprocessing, but they didn't stop the enrichment. So, and then North Korea said, "You're in violation of the agreement. We're good. You didn't comply with the agreement. We have every right to have our nuclear program." And then, of course, the other angle you hear a lot about, which has some merit, is given that the U.S. had convinced Gaddafi in Libya to give up his program and then helped overthrow him, given that they sort of pressured Saddam Hussein and then overthrew him, Kim Il-sung could say, why should I believe that you will do any, and you didn't follow up on this agreement, and you're now getting out of the Iranian agreement. Well, why should I trust you when my survival is dependent on these weapons? Now, a new angle that has come up, at least in Washington discussions, which I hadn't heard before, is there were some in the Trump administration who believe that not only does Kim Jong-un want the weapons to deter the U.S., but that if he actually had enough weapons that could hit U.S. targets, he would then feel free to attack South Korea and deter the U.S. from protecting South Korea. Does it say you want to lose Los Angeles or Washington for Seoul? No, you don't want to do that. So this is a new angle that is being used in discussions about what the U.S. policy ought to do. But with this highly classified stuff, what's actually going on, no, I don't know. Yes, sir.
What are the real obstacles for the United States and other weapon states to lead by example and start a process to eliminate nuclear weapons?
Yeah, so that's a great question. A process of elimination, lead by example. So this is actually what President Obama decided to do. He said, we're going to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in national security strategy. We're going to lower the numbers in every way. We're not going to use them. No new nuclear weapon designs can be developed in the national labs at Lawrence Livermore or at Los Alamos or at Sandia. And then the observers said, well, what has happened? What has happened since that time, and it was established in 2009, 2010 by Obama, so that's 7 years ago, Russia has greatly accelerated and expanded its nuclear program and has developed at least one declaratory policy called escalate to de-escalate, where they're talking about in their own language, in their own military papers, an attack in the Baltics with a small nuclear weapon use, say escalate, to then de-escalate, no more nuclear weapon use. In other words, they would use nuclear weapons first rather than wait till an extreme situation. The Chinese have slowly but surely expanded their nuclear program. The Pakistanis have greatly expanded their program. The Indians have a little bit expanded their program. The Israelis we don't even know about. So the punchline from skeptics is, we tried this approach, we tried to be the good guy, set the right example, and all that happened as a result is everyone else accelerated in the other direction. It seemed, President Trump has now said he wants the greatest, newest, best, fanciest nuclear arsenal of all time. He's willing to spend $1 trillion over the next 10 years for it. A lot of this actually is about the delivery vehicles. It's not about the weapons. Submarines and bombers and missiles cost a lot more money than the weapons. So at least as of now, the sort of betting money is we're not going to be following, Trump will not be following the Obama, and of course also Trump isn't very interested in following Obama on most issues. So it would appear that we tried that and now Trump's going to go off in a new direction. But it's not known, the devil's in the details. Let's see what they actually propose. Any of you want to drop out and head to New Zealand? Yes.
What's your opinion on the efficacy of nuclear states implementing no first use policies, or is that just empty?
Right. So China has a no first use policy. Russia had one, but they have now rescinded. They said, the U.S. has never had a no first use policy. The U.S. policy has always been sort of intentionally vague. We'll see. It all depends on the circumstances. Israel has never said we'll have a no first use policy. And India and Pakistan. So only China has a no first use policy among the current nuclear states. The other thing is, again, a skeptic would say, what I say and what I do are two different things. What I say is declaratory policy. What I do is employment policy. Why should we limit ourselves in any way to some declaration when we might have to do it in the real world? So even under Obama, and Obama looked at this, Obama himself personally rejected the idea of the U.S. no first use policy. This was considered for the Nuclear Posture Review 2010 that I worked on, and he personally rejected it. Yes, sir.
Just on that, there's a lot of talk that when Russia changed to escalate to de-escalate, it was almost to get the West used to the idea of them using the systems. And it's kind of the same thing you talked about with the trading South Korea for Los Angeles. It's, are we going to trade Poland and those little periphery NATO allies for, a nuke hitting in Russia?
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Status of European nuclear weapons programs, specifically the French and the British, they continue to modernize as they...
The French and the British have close to a minimum deterrence strategy. They have a few hundred deliverable weapons, and they haven't done much to go beyond. One difference between the French and the British has a substantial anti-nuclear community. The French do not. I've spent time in both countries, and no French government has had a problem with an anti-nuclear community. The British do have it. But even so, every time there's a new British prime minister, a new government, they have to review the policy. The French just sort of go along with it. I remember one very memorable experience I had. There was a man named Pierre Gallois. He's the father of the French Force Craft, French nuclear forces. And I had a chance to meet with him many years ago in his fabulous apartment in Paris, high ceilings, beautiful. And he invited just Pierre Gallois, General Gallois, Madame Gallois, and Monsieur Nacht. I said, my wife wouldn't believe this if I told you. And he brought me into a fantastic, majestic, long dining room. And he sat at, General Gallois sat at one end, and Madame Gallois at the other end, and I sat in the middle, just 3 people. We must have had 12 people serving dinner. It was fantastic. And then as it finished, he said to me, So two things. He said to me, he said, Monsieur Nacht, into the study for cigars and brandy. Sounds good. And he said to his wife, he dismissed her. There was no sentence. So I went into the study with Pierre Galois, and he said, Monsieur Nacht, you have to remember one thing about we French. He said, we have fought many wars since 1870. We fought the Germans in 1870. We fought the Germans in 1914. We fought the Germans in 1940. We fought the Vietnamese in 1954. We fought the Algerians in 1959. We have always lost. We have always lost. That's why we need nuclear weapons. We must have nuclear weapons to maintain, to guard French sovereignty. And he wasn't kidding around. He was a key nuclear advisor to General de Gaulle and to the follow-up French administrations. I remember that very distinctly. So, it depends on the different circumstances. There are no other European countries at the moment that are on the nuclear proliferation list. There is a NATO nuclear capability, but it's controlled by the Americans. There are nuclear weapons, this is public information, in 5 European states, in Belgium, and in the Netherlands, in Germany, in Italy, and in Turkey. 5 bases in those countries have nuclear weapons under NATO command, but their use is authorized by the United States. I had an opportunity to share something called the name of what it was called. It's the group that basically determines nuclear policy for NATO, and I had 27 other country representatives there. And when we'd have a coffee break or tea break, countries from the Eastern European part that had come more recently, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, they come up to me, not that it was Michael, but the representative of the United States, and say, we can't tell you how thankful we are to you that you have permitted us to enter NATO, because if we didn't enter NATO, we'd be under Russian control today. Just tell me what they told me. Yes. Yeah.
Sort of on the subject of Russian foreign policy, do you have any comment about the ongoing situation with Russia and Crimea and sort of the conflict with Ukraine?
Russia and Ukraine and Crimea? Yeah, well, fortunately, that has not been a nuclear issue. That's another issue. I mean, in 1994, after the Soviet Union had collapsed, Ukraine had quite a number of nuclear weapons, Soviet weapons on Ukrainian territory. And Ukraine said, we have to keep them for our survival. And the Americans, this was under Clinton, said, no. The Americans and the Russians and the British will sign a treaty, the Budapest Agreement, to guarantee your sovereignty if you give up the weapons. And we'll give you some energy in addition. So the Ukrainians gave up their weapons, and that lasted until the Russians went into Ukraine in 2014. So Ukraine has no weapons that are at risk. Crimea has no weapons. I mean, there's a separate matter about violation of Ukrainian sovereignty, but it's not a nuclear issue. Yes, sir.
Yes, on the note on tactical nuclear weapons in Western Europe,
Yes.
what is the possibility of having that in South Korea? And will that if we put that tactical nuclear weapons in South Korea,
Right.
Will that prevent South Korea to develop its own nuclear weapons?
Yeah, so that's another interesting question. So it turns out during the Cold War, the U.S. had nuclear weapons, U.S. nuclear weapons stationed in South Korea. We had a large number of weapons, several thousand. And then, no, it was later, even when George H.W. Bush was in power at the end of the Cold War, he said, we don't need these weapons. Cold War's over. North Korea's not going to attack. They're a vassal of the Soviet Union. They won't do it. So we pulled out all of them. So all the nuclear weapons that the U.S. had in South Korea were withdrawn in the early 90s. And they haven't been replaced. So now, as recently as this year, the South Korean defense minister has publicly said, we want you to bring them back. But U.S. policy at the moment, as far as I know, is no. We have many other capabilities in the area. We don't want to add nuclear weapons to South Korea.
And the reason for that?
Again, it would be part of depends upon how you view it, to be part of like a proliferation move. It would look counter to U.S. policy. Of course, it's supportive of an ally, but again, it's also proliferating the weapons, even though it's proliferating under U.S. control. This is not the end of the story, though. This is today's story. Who knows what will happen tomorrow with North Korea?
Another question. I think it was '96 when Robert McNamara visited Berkeley. He wrote a book and was giving a talk. And he is Berkeley graduate, I think. And he was Secretary of Defense during Vietnam times. So there were 300 plus students attending his talk, and there were a lot of questions. So one student, obviously from Asia, asked a question if the administration at that time considered dropping nuclear bomb on Vietnam. And he paused for a few minutes and said yes, but we decided not to do it.
Right, that's right.
So is there any case?
Yes, so it turns out there's a book called Force Without War and other books that chronicle the numerous times the decision about using U.S. nuclear weapons went to the president. Turned out quite a few times. It was true during the Korean War. It was true, the French officially asked the Americans to use a nuclear weapon to stop the Viet Minh from destroying French forces at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. And multiple other times. And every time the American president, Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, said, U.S. nuclear weapon use is only against an existential threat to the United States. We're not going to use nuclear weapons to defend an ally. We use a lot of force, but not nuclear force. And that has held up to tonight. Yeah, hi.
We hear a lot about a lack of staffing in the Department of Energy and
Yes.
the State Department.
Yes.
Who is staffing like the new posture review, and are there kind of
Great question. It's an alarming trend under Trump. So many posts have remained vacant. Now they claim the Democrats in the Congress have held it up, but many people have never been nominated. And in the State Department, for example, the State Department arms control head for like the New START treaty, is called the Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. Never been nominated. It's vacant. The head of the Bureau of Verification Arms Control is vacant. Defense is doing a little bit better, but still they're way behind. So actually, that's one of the reasons I'm interested in attending this meeting. I know some of the people who will be there, but I think a lot of the posts are vacant. The Trump administration view appears to be that we actually don't need so many people. We can do it with a much smaller group of people. And that's their position. The State Department has much more severe, Tillerson has agreed to a third cut, 1/3 cut in the State Department budget. That had a lot of development assistance, that had a lot of diplomacy. We have many ambassadorships vacant all over the world. Unprecedented. Never before since the Cold War started have we had this situation. So, you get the last question.
All right.
Correction.
So, I just wonder what would be your advice to the administration on how to deal with North Korea and their nuclear capacity and nuclear program?
Yeah. I wish I had a good answer. I don't have a good answer. And I think that the Chinese do have a lot of cards. But the Chinese really would prefer, I think, the status quo. They prefer a communist nuclear-armed North Korea and a stalemate in Korea. They don't want a war in Korea. They don't want North Koreans flying over the border into China. They certainly don't want a united Korea that's controlled by the United States, that's an ally of the United States. So we have to find ways to really reach the Chinese. Now, we have a lot of trade with them. That's both a great mutual benefit. But that's a card we could play if necessary. On the other hand, Xi Jinping has just within the last couple of weeks solidified his power. He's the most powerful Chinese leader since Mao Zedong. There are 8 major standing committees in the Chinese government. Xi Jinping, for the first time in Chinese history, is the chair of every one. So he alone will determine this. So a lot may depend on the actual Trump Xi Jinping relationship. And it's hard to read. So I wish I had great suggestions, but I think, as a lot of experts have said, it's either the negotiating table or war. We know that war would be horrific, just absolutely horrific. So we should keep trying the negotiation route, but we just don't know how long that will be sustained if Kim Jong-un wants to keep testing and so forth. So it's a very dangerous situation. Don't think about it. Have a good time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.